The wind carried the sound of emptiness that morning, the kind that makes trees speak in hollow voices. Snow had fallen through the night, soft at first, then cruel, until it covered every trace of life. Beneath it, a small figure trudged forward, a boy no older than 12, his coat too thin, his steps too heavy for the weight of another cold day. Hunger had a voice, and it whispered inside his stomach like a restless ghost. His name was Elias, though no one had called him that in months. He had forgotten what a warm voice sounded like. The last words he remembered were his mother's prayer, spoken by the fire before they fled. God, give us bread, even if it must fall from heaven. Since then, the world had burned, the rivers had turned to ice, and heaven had been silent. Yet Elias still searched, not only for food, but for a reason to keep walking. He followed the smell of pine and the faint smoke that lingered from abandoned villages. Sometimes he found a rusted can, sometimes only bones. Once a raven followed him for miles, circling above like a shadow that refused to leave. He began to talk to it quietly, as if to keep himself from fading away. "If you see bread," he would whisper, "save me a crumb." The raven never answered, but it never left. That morning, the forest was different. The wind carried something unfamiliar, not the scent of death or decay, but with smoke faint and living. Elias stopped. His heart thudded beneath his ribs. Somewhere beyond the slope, something still burned. He climbed, step by step, through snow that reached his knees, until he saw it, a thin gray column rising through the trees, almost invisible in the pale sky. He stared for a long time, unsure if his mind was playing tricks. Hunger could paint illusions, he knew that. But this smoke was steady, real. He pressed his hand against his chest, whispered a trembling prayer. "If it's danger, let me be brave. If it's bread, let me be grateful." Then he walked toward the smoke, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the frozen world. The forest thinned, revealing a clearing. At its center stood an old cabin, leaning slightly as if tired of standing against the wind. The roof was heavy with snow, and the chimney sighed a thread of smoke into the gray air. Elias felt both hope and fear. Hope that someone was alive, fear that they might not welcome a starving stranger. He touched the wooden cross he wore on a string around his neck, the only thing he had saved from his mother's hands. His fingers trembled. "Please," he whispered, though he didn't know to whom. Maybe to the cabin. Maybe to God. Maybe to his mother, if she could still hear him through heaven's snow. The trees watched in silence as he took his first step into the clearing. His breath clouded before him, small and fragile. The sound of creaking would reach his ears, the old cabin shifting under the weight of years. Somewhere inside, something groaned softly, as if remembering. Elias paused. His stomach twisted again, the whisper of hunger returning, sharp and aching. But beyond the pain, there was a faint sense of promise, the kind that feels like dawn breaking behind closed eyes. He did not yet know that what he would find inside that cabin would change everything. That beneath its floor, the earth held more than darkness. It held the memory of faith, buried but not forgotten. And so, with a breath that trembled between fear and hope, Elias began to walk toward the door. The climb felt endless. Snow pressed against Elias's legs, his boots soaked through and stiff with ice. The closer he got, the heavier the silence became. Not the kind that comforts, but the kind that listens. The cabin stood at the crest of the hill like a weary sentinel, its timbers gray and splintered, its roof bowed under the years. Smoke still trickled from the chimney, thin and uncertain, like a dying breath that refused to leave the world. Elias stopped at the edge of the clearing. His breath came in shivers, white against the air. He could hear the creak of trees, the low moan of wind brushing the cabin's walls, and the slow beat of his own heart. His stomach growled, echoing through the cold. The whisper of hunger had become a roar now, urging him forward. But his fear held him there, frozen as the snow. He imagined the people who might live inside. Maybe an old couple who had survived the war. Maybe a soldier hiding from ghosts. Maybe no one at all. The thought of food pulled him toward the door. The thought of guns and strangers pulled him back. He crouched beside a fallen pine and waited, his eyes tracing every shadow that moved across the frosted window. Nothing stirred. Only the wind breathed. Minutes stretched into hours. The smoke thinned. His hope dimmed with it. The boy pressed his hands together, rubbing them for warmth, and whispered, "If someone is there, let them have mercy. If no one is there, let me find something to live another day." His voice was barely louder than the snow falling around him, yet it seemed to echo through the valley like a small prayer carried by the wind. At last, he rose. The world felt smaller, colder. Each step toward the cabin made the boards groan louder beneath the snow. Up close, the walls were scarred with time. Claw marks from storms, dark stains of smoke and rain. A broken shutter swung loosely, thudding against the wall. He touched it gently, as if greeting an old friend. "You've seen worse than me," he whispered to the wood. "Maybe you'll let me in." The door was heavy, its iron latch rusted and frozen. He pushed once, it didn't move. He pressed harder, shoulder trembling, until the hinge shrieked and the door cracked open just enough for him to slip through. The smell of old wood and ashes hit him. The air inside was stale but warmer than outside. Dust floated like ghosts in the faint light filtering through the window. He stood still for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust. The cabin was small, a single room with a broken table, a few chairs, and what had once been a hearth. Ashes still clung to the stone like old memories of warmth. Against the far wall, a bed frame leaned crooked, its mattress long gone. Yet despite the emptiness, Elias felt something here, a trace of life, faint but real. Someone had been here not long ago. He crouched near the hearth. The ashes were cold, but under them he found a charred piece of wood, still faintly warm at the core. He turned it over in his fingers. Hours ago, he thought. Someone made this fire hours ago. His heart raced. He looked around, listening for any sign of movement, a breath, a footstep, a whisper. Nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was not truly empty. The corners seemed to hold their breath, the floor groaning quietly beneath his boots as if speaking a language of warning. He took off his backpack, the same one that had carried nothing but hope for days, and placed it by the hearth. Then he gathered broken wood from the floor and began to build a small fire. His hands shook as he struck the match. When the flame caught, his heart did too. Warmth spread slowly, like a memory returning. The boy's shoulders softened. He sat close to the light, letting the fire paint color back into his face. For the first time in many nights, the darkness did not feel like an enemy. Outside, the wind whispered across the hill, circling the cabin like a guardian. The smoke rose steady and sure again, curling into the gray sky, a signal of life in a world that had forgotten such signs. Elias closed his eyes, whispering softly, "Thank you, whoever you are." He didn't yet know that beneath the very floor where he now sat, something ancient was waiting. Something that once belonged to another child, one who had also prayed for bread and warmth in a time of ruin. For now, Elias simply breathed, the warmth against his face feeling like an answer. The door had let him in, but not without protest. Now, with the fire learning the old stone's language and a weak braid of warmth uncoiling into the room, Elias turned back to the entrance. The wood looked older from the inside, bleached by winters and scored by nails that had missed their mark. Frost feathered along the edges, delicate as lace, thick as iron. Each breath he drew drifted toward it and faded, as if the door swallowed warmth the way hunger swallowed hope. He pressed his palm to the latch. Cold shot through his hand like a needle. Snow hissed under the threshold as the wind shouldered the cabin and tried to pry its way in. Elias nudged the door closed until the swollen plank settled into its groove with a tired thud. The hinge groaned like an animal. He tested it. The latch held, but only barely. If a stronger gust came, or a human hand, this door would fail. He scanned the room for a bar. There was none. Only a chair with one leg splinted by twine, and a length of timber propped against the wall like a crutch discarded by the house. He dragged the timber across the floor. It rasped over knots and nail heads, and the sound filled the small room like a warning. When he leaned it under the latch, bracing the door at an angle, the wood met wood with a steadiness that comforted him. Still, the draft threaded through. The door was closed, but its memory of opening would not let it rest. Elias stood listening. Wind combed the pines outside with patient fingers. The cabin answered in creaks and sighs. Somewhere deep, A noise like a low tap rippled through the boards, then was gone. He held his breath, waiting for it to return, but only the fire offered a small conversation. Pop, settle, breathe. He turned the chair toward the hearth and sat, boots stretched toward the warmth, hands lifted over it like a beggar asking alms from a saint. Steam rose from his socks. The smell was of damp wool and smoke, and under it all the honest scent of sap and old ash. Hunger paced inside him in slow circles. He searched the room with his eyes, hoping for the promise of food. Any crumb, any jar, even a pot that smelled of something once cooked. The table held a broken plate and the ghost of a meal that lived only in stains. Beside the hearth lay a blackened kettle. He lifted it, empty, but when he tilted it to the light, he saw a thin fur of salt along the rim, the leftover of boiled water. Someone had been careful here. Someone had known how to stretch nothing. He thought of his mother. Her hands were always a little cracked in winter, red at the knuckles, smelling of bread when they were lucky and of river when they were not. She had taught him to listen to doors. A door that sticks is a door that keeps you, she'd say, smiling, and a door that swings too freely might let the wrong wind in. He closed his eyes and mouthed the words, tasting them like crumbs. Then he rose and went to the entrance again. Snow had crept through the gap along the sill and lay in a narrow drift like spilled flour. He brushed it away, and his fingers found a shallow groove worn into the wood where a bar might once have rested. He measured it with his palm. The right size for the timber now bracing the latch. Whoever lived here had barred this door in other winters. Elias pressed his ear to the plank. It was like listening to a seashell. Wind roared far away, and beneath it a softer thrum, steady as a hidden spring. He unwrapped the scarf from his neck, the threadbare one he had found in a barn weeks ago, and stuffed it into the crack along the jamb. The draft weakened. He sealed the bottom with a strip torn from the lining of his coat. It left his ribs more naked to the cold, but the fire's heat lingered now. He breathed, and for a moment the air tasted less like iron and more like wood warmed from within. When the next gust came, the door flexed and held. The timber complained. The hinge squealed. A spat of snow rattled the window. Elias flinched. Reflex had a memory older than thought. He reached for the cross on its string and closed his eyes until the house settled again. The wind moved on, stalking the ridge, shouldering pines, forgetting him as bigger storms remember only mountains. He used the lull to explore. He lifted the broken plate, touched the ash-softened rim of the hearth, traced the map of scratches on the table. Near the post of the bed frame, he found a strip of fabric knotted around a nail, faded blue with a pattern of tiny white flowers. He stroked it with his thumb. A girl's ribbon, maybe, or the seam of a dress cut for rags. He thought of the raven that had followed him for days and pictured it perched on that post, head tilted, black eyes reading the room without mercy. "You'd like this place," he whispered, and the whisper sounded almost like company. He ate what he had. 2 end pieces of a hard crust he had saved too long. He softened them over the steam of the kettle, tealess and clean, and chewed while the fire told him small stories of patience. The bread hurt his gums and comforted them in the same bite. He held each piece in his mouth long enough to trick his belly into believing more would come. When it was gone, he licked the salt from the rim of the kettle, then laughed quietly at himself. The laugh turned into a prayer without changing shape. "Thank you for this room," he said, "for the hinge that still remembers how to hold." The light outside began to dim in that gray way winter has, where the afternoon quietly pretends to be evening. Shadows deepened in the cabin's corners. Elias set another shard of wood to the fire. The flame leaned forward, then straightened, as if taking a breath. He listened again, and again the faint tap came from somewhere below the floor, a shy knock or a settling beam or the house testing him. He told himself it was nothing. He was a boy inside a room and rooms have noises. Yet the door drew his eyes back one more time. Frost along its edges had begun to sweat into beads, then into thin threads that ran and froze again. The sight felt like a message he could not read. He rose and placed his palm on the plank. The cold had softened, just a little. "Stay," the door seemed to say now. "Stay and keep the fire alive." He promised it he would, at least until morning. He lay down near the hearth and pulled his pack beneath his head. The timber braced the latch, the scarf filled the crack, the wind wore itself thin on the hill. Before sleep, he whispered the shortest prayer he knew, the one his mother used to say between one task and the next. 3 words that fit in the space of a breath. Keep us, Lord. The door did not move. The night arranged itself outside. Inside, the house held him the way a hand holds a bird. Firm enough to protect, gentle enough to let it breathe. Morning came slowly, as if reluctant to enter the cabin. The fire had sunk into a bed of gray ash, its last breath curling toward the cold air that leaked through the roof. Elias woke to silence. Thick, endless silence that made him forget what day it was, or whether days still mattered at all. His hands were numb, but his heart was steady. The cabin had kept its promise. It held through the night. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and looked around. The faint light from the single window revealed the bones of the room in shades of silver and dust. Snow had slipped through cracks in the wall, forming thin ribbons along the floorboards. His breath fogged the air like a small ghost. He pulled his coat tighter and stood, his knees stiff and trembling. As he turned to feed the fire again, he noticed it, something that hadn't been there before. Near the hearth, in the film of dust that covered the floor, a mark had appeared. A footprint. Small, lighter than his own, but clear enough to see the outline of toes and heel. Elias froze. His first thought was that it must be his, but no, the angle was wrong. The print led toward the far wall, not from it. He knelt, touched the edge of the print. The dust shifted slightly under his finger. Fresh. He swallowed. His eyes swept across the room. Everything seemed still unchanged. The chair, the kettle, his pack by the wall. But now the silence had weight, a kind of listening. He rose, stepping softly, scanning the corners. The light shifted as a cloud passed over the hill, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement near the door, a flicker of shadow that wasn't his own. He took a step forward. The boards creaked underfoot. "Hello," he whispered. No answer. His voice felt small, swallowed by the wood and dust. He waited, holding his breath, counting heartbeats. Nothing. Only the sound of wind fingering the walls outside. Still, something inside him stirred, an instinct, half fear, half curiosity. He followed the footprint. It led toward the far corner, where a pile of old blankets lay beside a collapsed shelf. He crouched and pulled one of them aside. The smell of mold and old smoke hit him. Beneath, only splinters and stone. But then, another print, smaller this time, leading toward the window. His pulse quickened. He crossed the room in 3 steps and looked outside. Snow stretched unbroken to the tree line. No tracks. No sign of life. Only the soft gray dawn pressing against the glass. He wiped a circle in the frost with his sleeve and peered out. Nothing moved. The world was as empty as it had been when he found it. He leaned his forehead against the glass. Maybe it had been a dream, he thought. Maybe the wind or an animal had left that mark. But when he turned, he saw it again, there in the dust near his pack. Another print. The same size. The same direction. Toward the hearth. Toward him. Fear crept up his spine like ice water. He backed away until his shoulders touched the cold wall. The fire hissed as he dropped another piece of wood onto it. The noise startled him. It sounded too alive, too loud in the quiet. He reached for the small knife he kept tied to his belt. It wasn't much, just a broken kitchen blade with cloth wrapped around the handle. But it gave him something to hold on to. He waited. Minutes passed. Then something soft, a creak from beneath the floorboards. Slow. Careful. Almost human. Elias crouched, pressing his ear to the ground. The sound came again, faint but clear, a shuffling, a dragging noise as though someone or something was moving below the cabin. He jerked back, heart pounding. Beneath the floor. The memory of last night's tapping returned to him, the shy knock he'd dismissed as the house settling. It hadn't been the wood. It had been this. Whatever this was. He knelt again, this time listening longer. The sound had stopped. Only the pulse in his ears now. He could feel the boards cold against his palms, and under them, a whisper of air, a draft rising through a narrow gap between 2 planks near the hearth. He moved closer, tracing the edges. The wood felt uneven. One board, slightly loose. His fingers found the seam and pulled gently. It shifted. A thin puff of cold air rose from the crack, carrying the scent of earth and something older. Stone, maybe, or ashes. He sat back, trembling. A tunnel. A cellar. He didn't know. But suddenly the footprints made sense. They led to this spot. He looked around again, half expecting to see the ghost of a child crouched in the corner, watching him. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind against the door. He pressed his hands together and whispered, "Lord, if it's danger, give me courage. If it's not, show me what to do." The wind answered softly, sliding across the roof like a sigh. Elias took that as a kind of permission. He sat before the hearth, eyes fixed on the loose plank. Beneath him something waited, silent, hidden, ancient. He would not open it yet. Not tonight. But he knew he would. Hunger had led him here. Now another kind of hunger, a deeper one, the hunger for meaning, began to stir. Outside, snow began to fall again, erasing the world's footprints, but inside the cabin, new ones had already been made. By the second night, the cabin had begun to breathe with him. Every sound had a rhythm. The fire's crackle, the sigh of wind, the faint groan of old beams remembering storms long past. Elias had learned to listen to it all. Not as noise, but as language. The cabin spoke in wood and wind, and though he could not yet understand its words, he knew one thing for certain. Something alive stirred beneath it. He had not slept well since he saw the footprints. Sleep came in fragments, light as dust. Each time his eyes closed, he heard that noise again, a soft, deliberate scrape beneath the floorboards, slow as breath, distant but near enough to taste in the air. He told himself it was a rat, or maybe the wind finding its way through cracks in the stone foundation. But the thought did not hold. The sound came only at night, only when the fire was low, and always in that same place, beneath the hearth where the wood was loose. By dawn, his fear had curdled into curiosity. Hunger, he thought, made people brave. Or foolish. Perhaps both. He needed to know. He knelt by the hearth. The ashes were cool, a soft gray veil over the stones. He brushed them aside, revealing the uneven line of the plank that didn't match the others. He pressed his fingers against it, solid but not firm. It shifted just slightly, and a faint puff of air escaped through the seam. It was cold, older than the air in the room, with the scent of earth that hadn't seen light in years. His heart began to race. He whispered to himself as if his own voice could keep him company. Just air. Nothing more. But the silence that followed disagreed. He sat back, staring at the floor. The firelight trembled on the walls, painting long shadows that swayed like ghosts. The cabin seemed to hold its breath with him. And then there it was again. The sound. Faint, hollow, a knock. Once. Then again. Not random. Not the scurry of an animal. It was rhythmic, like someone testing, waiting, listening back. Elias's throat tightened. He rose quickly, backing away until his legs hit the edge of the bed frame. He held his knife tight, its dull blade shaking in his hand. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice cracked, vanishing into the roof beams. "If you're down there, I don't mean harm." Silence. Only the whisper of the wind replied, brushing snow against the window. He waited, heart drumming, breath uneven, until the fire burned low again. Then, quietly, the knocking returned. This time softer, like fingertips against hollow wood. He stepped forward, kneeling again, drawn by something he couldn't name. He laid his ear to the plank. The cold bit through his skin. Beneath it, he could hear movement. Not footsteps, not shuffling, but a dragging sound, like fabric brushing stone. It came, paused, came again. He swallowed hard. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "If you're a person, say something." Nothing. The sound stopped. Elias waited. 1 minute. 2. Then a new noise. Quieter but clear. A click. Then another. Almost like metal striking stone. Or a latch. He shot to his feet, heart pounding. "No, no," he muttered. "Just the fire. Just the house." He turned away, forcing himself to the window to see the world outside. Anything to pull his mind away from that sound. The snow had stopped. The hill lay buried in white, silent and endless. The smoke from the chimney rose gently, honest and real. He breathed it in, grounding himself. But when he turned back, the floor had changed. The plank, the loose one, was lifted slightly now. Barely an inch, but enough. Enough to show that something beneath had pushed it. Elias froze. He didn't move. Didn't blink. His knife trembled in his hand, forgotten. The air felt thicker, colder, filled with something unseen. His heart beat so loud it seemed to echo. Then, as quietly as it had moved, the plank settled back into place. The sound beneath the floor faded, replaced again by the hum of the wind. Elias sank to his knees, shaking. He didn't know if he was frightened or simply awake in a way he'd never been before. Whatever lived under this cabin, whoever, had chosen not to reveal itself. Not yet. He pulled his blanket around him and sat by the hearth until dawn, staring at the floor, listening. The wood never moved again that night. But in the gray light of morning, when he looked closer, he saw it, a small smudge of earth along the edge of the plank. A fingerprint. Tiny. Human. And in that moment, the boy understood something. He was not alone. The next morning arrived without light. The sky outside was the color of tin, heavy and flat, pressing its weight upon the world. Elias woke to the sound of the wind breathing through the chimney, and for a long time he did not move. His eyes rested on the hearth, on that one uneven plank, and he felt the same quiet unease that had followed him into sleep. It waited there under the floor, unseen, patient. He stirred the ashes, adding the last piece of dry wood he had. Flames flickered weakly, then steadied, sending a thin veil of warmth through the cabin. Elias sat close, palms out, feeling his skin come back to life. His mind was a storm of questions. Who had made those footprints? Who had lifted the plank? And why had they not shown themselves? He decided he could not live with the question unanswered. Kneeling before the hearth, he pressed his fingers against the loose board. It shifted under his touch, and a faint current of cold air escaped through the seam, a breath from beneath. He felt his heart beating through his palms. He whispered, almost to himself, "Please, let this be safe." Then he pried. The sound was soft but final, wood giving way to truth. The plank came free with a sigh, revealing darkness below. A square hole no larger than his shoulders. From it rose a smell, damp earth, iron, and something faintly sweet, like old candles melted long ago. The air felt different, older, untouched by the winters above. Elias leaned closer, peering into the hollow. A few wooden rungs were nailed to the side of the opening, leading down into the dark. A tunnel. His pulse quickened. He could see only a faint outline, but enough to know it continued far beneath the cabin. He sat back on his heels, thinking. The smart thing would be to leave it closed. To keep the warmth, the safety, the illusion of peace. But the truth pressed on him heavier than hunger. He had been running from shadows for too long. From war, from loss, from himself. Now, the shadow waited below him, and something inside whispered that it was time to face it. He stood and grabbed a candle stub from the windowsill, lighting it from the hearth. The flame trembled, throwing pale light on his face and the edges of the opening. He looked around the cabin one last time, the broken table, the chair, the wooden cross on the wall, then whispered, "Stay here, fire. I'll come back." With that, he swung his legs over the hole and began to descend. The first step cracked but held. The second groaned like an old voice. The air grew colder, pressing against his skin like wet cloth. By the fourth rung, the light from above had faded into a faint gray halo. He reached the ground. The earth beneath was uneven and soft, covered in a thin layer of frost. The tunnel stretched before him, narrow and low, the walls made of packed soil and stone. Water dripped slowly from above, each drop echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. He held the candle out in front of him, its glow catching on something. Faint carvings along the wall. Shapes. Letters. Crosses. He stepped closer. They were rough, drawn by a trembling hand. He could read one word, scratched deep into the stone: mercy. His breath caught. He ran his fingers over it, the edges still sharp, as if carved not centuries ago but yesterday. Further in, the tunnel widened. The air smelled of smoke and something metallic. A few scraps of cloth lay half-buried in dirt, stiff with age. Then his candlelight caught a glint, a small metal box, half hidden near the corner. He knelt and brushed the soil away, lifting it carefully. It was rusted but intact. His heart pounded as he turned it over. On the lid, carved faintly by hand, were the initials LM. He tried to open it, but the latch held fast. His fingers shook. He could feel something shift inside, paper maybe. Or hope. He tucked it under his arm and turned back toward the ladder. But before he climbed, he glanced once more down the tunnel. There, in the faint edge of light, he saw another passage. Smaller, leading deeper still. The walls around it bore more carvings, more crosses. And just before the darkness swallowed them, one shape caught his eye. The outline of a small hand pressed into the wall, the fingers spread, frozen in time. It was a child's hand. Elias stood there, silent, the candle trembling in his grasp. The flame wavered, throwing shadows that danced like whispers. Somewhere far above, the wind groaned across the cabin roof, but down here there was only stillness. He climbed back up, clutching the box, his heart racing with fear and wonder. When he emerged into the cabin, the fire still burned low as if waiting for him. He set the box beside the hearth and closed the plank gently, sealing the tunnel again. He stared at the floor for a long time. Then he smiled, a small, trembling smile. Whatever had called to him from beneath, it hadn't been to harm. It had been to remember. The fire had burned down to embers by the time Elias found the courage to open the box. He sat close to it, legs folded beneath him, the shadows long and slow on the cabin walls. The wind outside had gone quiet, and for once the world felt suspended, a breath between storms. He turned the small metal box in his hands. Rust flaked off like dried blood, and the hinges complained softly as he worked them loose with the tip of his knife. When the lid finally opened, a faint scent escaped. Wax, dust, and something else, something warm like wood smoke and forgotten prayers. Inside lay a candle, half melted, wrapped in cloth. Beneath it, a small wooden cross, smooth from the touch of fingers that had prayed long before his time. And under the cross, folded carefully, a piece of paper browned with age. Elias lifted the candle first. It was short, its wick blackened and hardened, as if it had been lit and then blown out halfway through a prayer. He held it up to the light and whispered, "You must have seen the dark too." The wax felt soft, faintly scented with honey. Then he took the cross in his hand. It was simple. 2 thin twigs bound with a strip of cloth, the knot still tight. The touch of it steadied him. For the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel since his mother's last breath, presence. As though someone somewhere still listened. He pressed the cross to his lips and closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. He wasn't sure if he spoke to God, or to the hands that had made it, or to the child whose small fingerprint he'd seen carved below. Maybe it didn't matter. When he unfolded the paper, his heart began to race. The handwriting was small and uneven, written in pencil now faded to silver. "To whoever finds this place, we were here. My name is LM. I was 10 when the soldiers came. My mother told me to hide beneath the floor. She said the dark would keep me safe, and the Lord would keep me fed. There was a candle and a loaf of bread and her cross. I waited for her to return, but she did not. If you find this, light the candle for her, so she may see her way home." Elias read the words again and again, his eyes burning. 10 years old. The same age he'd been when the world around him fell apart. He looked toward the plank that covered the tunnel and imagined the small hand carving the word mercy into the stone. The silence below the floor no longer felt empty. It felt full, as if that prayer still lived down there, echoing softly through the earth. He stood, the letter trembling in his hand. He placed the candle on the hearth and touched the wick to the fire. The flame caught slowly, uncertain, then straightened, glowing steady and golden. The air seemed to warm with it. He set the candle near the edge of the floor, above where the tunnel began. Light seeped through the cracks, faint but visible, a thin ribbon of gold spilling into the dark below. "There," Elias whispered. "You can find your way now." The cabin seemed to sigh, a soft creak of wood and wind that almost sounded like a thank you. He sat there for a long time, watching the candle burn, the flame steady even as the draft moved through the room. Then, something strange. The fire in the hearth flickered in rhythm with the candle's flame, as though the two shared a single breath. The air shimmered, and for a heartbeat, Elias thought he saw a figure near the far wall, a faint outline of a woman kneeling, her hands folded. She was not frightening. She was still gentle, as if made of smoke and memory. The image faded with the next gust of wind, leaving only warmth in its wake. Elias did not move. He could feel the weight of the cross in his hand and the echo of something larger than fear. He remembered his mother's prayer, "God, give us bread, even if it must fall from heaven." Now he understood. Bread was not always food. Sometimes it was hope, a piece of someone's faith left behind to feed another. He tucked the letter and the cross back into the box, leaving the candle to burn. The flame bent once, then steadied again. It had waited years for this moment, to be seen, to be remembered. Outside, snow began to fall once more, slow and silent. Through the window, Elias could see the faint reflection of the candle's glow against the glass, a single point of light in the gray world beyond. He whispered, "Rest now, LM. She'll find you." The candle flickered in reply, and the boy smiled, tired but at peace. The fire crackled softly beside him. It sounded like a hymn half remembered. And for the first time since he'd left the ruins of his home, Elias did not feel alone. The candle burned through the night. Its flame stayed still, golden and steady, untouched by the wind that breathed through the cracks in the walls. Elias slept lightly beside it, his body curled close to the fire, one hand resting on the wooden box as if to guard the memory it carried. When morning came, pale and silent, he awoke to find the candle almost gone, a pool of wax cradling the last flicker of light. He touched the box gently, tracing the letters carved on the lid, LM. That small name had become a heartbeat in the cabin, pulsing beneath the silence. The fire was dying again, so he fed it with the last of the wood. As he reached for another piece, the plank near the hearth, the one he had pried open, shifted slightly under his knee. Not from the wind this time, nor from any living hand. It was as if the floor itself remembered the touch of his curiosity and invited him once more to look beneath. He hesitated only a moment. Then, setting the box beside him, he lifted the board again. The air that rose from below was colder than before, yet strangely clean, like the breath of a church kept closed for centuries. He held his candle stub above the opening, but the light barely reached the bottom. Still, something glimmered faintly, a reflection of metal or glass. He descended again, slow and careful, feeling the rungs creak beneath his weight. The earth smelled of rain and rust. When he reached the ground, the candlelight stretched out in trembling arcs along the tunnel walls. And there, against the far wall, he saw it, the faint glint he'd noticed before. A tin box, smaller than the first, half buried in dirt. Its surface was dented, its clasp bent, but it bore a small engraving, a dove carrying a branch. He knelt, brushing the soil away with his fingers until the lid came free. The box opened easily. Inside, folded papers lay bound by twine darkened with age. The ink had bled into the paper, yet the words were still legible. The first letter began with a prayer. "To my son, if you find this, we are safe in spirit. Do not fear the dark. It only hides what must wait for the light." The handwriting was strong, certain. Beneath it, another letter. More hurried, the strokes uneven. "The war has taken our house. We are scattered. But faith is not built from walls or roofs. It lives wherever we remember love." Elias's eyes filled as he read. The letters were written by different hands. A man, a woman, perhaps a child's scrawl among them. Dozens of notes, folded and tucked carefully inside. Prayers, farewells, blessings, all signed with initials. Families who had lived through winters like this one. Souls who had prayed for deliverance in this same place. One note made his breath catch. It was written in faded pencil, the same uneven script as the letter from LM. Mother, if you ever come back, I've left the candle burning. Follow the light. It means I'm still waiting. Elias closed his eyes, holding the paper to his chest. He could almost hear the faint echo of that child's voice beneath the ground. Not sorrowful, but faithful. He gathered the letters carefully, setting them back in their box. He realized this place was not a hiding place for fear, but a sanctuary of remembrance. The tunnel beneath the cabin was a vault of faith, the kind that refuses to die, even when everything else does. When he climbed back to the surface, his heart felt heavier and lighter all at once. The world above seemed brighter. Snowlight filtered through the small window, scattering over the wooden floor like silver dust. He placed the new box beside the first one on the hearth. 2 boxes now, 2 generations of hope bound by wood and wax and prayer. He opened the window a crack, letting in the cold morning air. The forest outside was still waiting. Elias took one of the letters, the one signed by LM, and read it aloud, his voice steady though his throat ached. If you find this, light the candle for her, so she may see her way home. He paused, looking toward the empty hills. I did, he whispered. And I think she did too. The air in the room shifted, gentle, warm, almost like a breath against his cheek. The candle's final flame fluttered once, then went out, leaving behind a faint thread of smoke curling upward like a prayer released. Elias smiled. He gathered the boxes, wrapped them in his scarf, and placed them near the hearth as if returning something sacred to its altar. The cabin, once hollow and broken, now felt alive. The walls seemed to hum with quiet reverence. Outside, the first rays of sun broke through the clouds, scattering light across the hill. He whispered, "You were never alone down there." And for the first time he believed the same of himself. Morning came softly, not with brilliance, but with grace. The first light filtered through the frost-rimmed window, washing the cabin in a pale gold that felt almost alive. The snow outside glowed faintly, as if the earth itself had remembered warmth. Elias stirred from a shallow sleep near the hearth, wrapped in his coat and the scent of ashes. The boxes lay where he had left them, side by side like 2 sleeping hearts. He rose slowly, every joint stiff from the cold. The fire had died in the night, leaving only a thin ribbon of smoke that curled toward the roof beams. He knelt to stir the ashes and found, beneath the gray dust, one ember still red and breathing. He smiled, faint, tired but full. You held on, he whispered. He added a scrap of wood, then another, and cupped his hands around the ember until flame blossomed again. The cabin filled with a low orange glow, gentle as dawn. It flickered across the old walls, over the cracked window, and up to the cross still resting where he had left it. For a moment, it seemed as if the whole room bowed in reverence to that small spark of life. Elias sat back on his heels and watched the fire climb. His hunger was a quiet ache now, familiar, no longer cruel. The world outside was still, the kind of stillness that comes after something holy has passed. He felt it in his bones, the sense that the night had changed him, that the boy who entered this cabin in search of bread was not the same boy who now watched the morning light. He reached for the letter again, the one signed LM, and unfolded it slowly. The words shimmered faintly in the firelight, the handwriting fragile but proud. Follow the light, it had said. And here it was, spilling through the window, warm on his face, real. He closed his eyes and let the sunlight touch him. For the first time in months, he didn't feel hunted by the past. He felt found. He gathered the letters and placed them carefully back inside their box, then wrapped both boxes in a torn blanket. You've waited long enough, he said quietly. It's time to see the day again. He stepped outside. The cold struck him like a breath, sharp but clean. The world stretched before him in white silence. The hill dipped gently toward the forest below, where the trees stood heavy with snow. He could see his footprints from yesterday, a lonely path leading up from the valley. But this morning, the light softened even that loneliness. Elias walked to a spot just beyond the cabin, where the ground caught the full warmth of the rising sun. There, he knelt and placed the 2 boxes side by side in the snow. The light glimmered off the metal lids, turning the frost into tiny sparks. He bowed his head and whispered, "Rest now. You're home." A breeze moved through the pines, low and tender, like a mother's sigh. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the clearing, warming his hands, his face, his heart. He stayed there for a long time, watching the snow glitter and melt in small tears of light. When he returned to the cabin, something inside had shifted. The place no longer felt haunted, it felt inhabited. Every creak of the wood, every flutter of wind through the roof, seemed part of a living him. The floorboards above the hidden tunnel no longer frightened him. They felt like the pulse of faith running beneath his feet. He sat by the fire and whispered a prayer of gratitude, simple and small. "Thank you for hunger that led me here. Thank you for the light that waited." For a while, he watched the smoke drift upward and disappear through the chimney, carried to the same sky that held all prayers. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, wrapping the cabin in silence once more. Yet within that silence lived a song, the kind only hearts could hear. And in that quiet, Elias understood. Sometimes light is not found, it finds you. Sparkles, if this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Our dream is to reach 1,000 hearts hearing these stories. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to spill warmth into the clearing. The snow outside glistened like crushed glass, and a single crow traced circles above the trees, black against the white sky. Inside the cabin, the air had softened. The fire hummed low and steady, its glow reflecting in Elias's tired eyes. He sat near the hearth, still holding the small cross he had found in the box. Its edges were worn smooth, and it felt like it had been shaped by countless prayers. His stomach ached, but not as sharply as before. Hunger had become something quieter, almost sacred, like a teacher rather than an enemy. He rose and searched the cabin once more. Every corner he explored now felt familiar, not strange. The fear that had followed him for weeks had melted into something gentler. Belonging. He ran his hand along the shelves, brushing away dust and spiderwebs, whispering, "Thank you," as if speaking to the walls themselves. Near the hearth, beneath a collapsed crate, his fingers brushed something solid. He pulled it free, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, hardened by age. The smell that escaped made his heart leap. Bread. It was old, dry, perhaps years forgotten. But it was bread nonetheless. He held it close, inhaling deeply, the scent faint yet unmistakable, wheat, smoke, and grace. He broke off a piece, hesitating. This was not just food. It was memory, perhaps even a relic. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you for what remains." Then he placed the smallest piece in his mouth. It was rough, almost tasteless, but it filled him with warmth. He imagined the hands that had baked it. Maybe a mother's, maybe a child's. Hands that had shaped faith into something you could hold. He ate slowly, reverently, like a communion of survival. Each bite felt like an answered prayer, not for plenty but for enough. When he finished, he gathered the crumbs and sprinkled them near the hearth, whispering, "For those who couldn't finish their meal." The light through the window shifted, landing across the floorboards above the hidden tunnel. For a heartbeat, the sunlight aligned perfectly with the spot where the candle had burned. The beam touched the wood, and the air seemed to shimmer. Elias smiled. "You're still here," he said softly. "Both of you." He sat back, watching the snow drift outside the window, the flakes gliding down like slow blessings. The world was quiet, but not empty. He felt the weight of his journey, the miles behind him, the hunger, the fear, and how all of it had led to this moment of stillness. He looked again at the bread in his hands. It had been waiting for him, hidden just as he had been hidden from the world. Not by chance, by design. His mother's prayer echoed in his memory. "God, give us bread, even if it must fall from heaven." He smiled faintly. "You did, Mama," he murmured. "You did." He tore one last piece of the loaf and placed it on the windowsill. "For whoever comes after me," he said. "So they'll know someone was here, and that hope still lives." The wind picked up gently, lifting a few flakes of snow through the small cracks in the wall. They danced briefly in the firelight before melting away. Elias watched them fade and whispered, "Go tell them the world still has kindness." He leaned back against the wall, feeling the warmth of the fire at his side and the cool breath of winter through the wood. His eyes grew heavy, but his spirit felt light. He knew he would leave soon. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. The road would call him again. Yet wherever he went, the candle's light would follow. The cross rested against his chest, the boxes of letters wrapped safely in his pack. The cabin no longer felt like a place of hiding. It was a place of beginning, a chapel carved from loss and lit by mercy. Outside, the crow cried once, circling above the hill as the afternoon sun touched the world with gold. Elias closed his eyes, a small smile on his face. "Thank you," he whispered one last time, "for the bread, and for the blessing." And for a long while the only sound was the fire breathing, gentle and eternal, as if echoing back the words, "You were never alone." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Our dream is to reach 1,000 hearts hearing these stories.